Welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast. We're here to show you how practical psychology can be useful and make your workplace better. I'm Dr. Ernest Wayde. I have another great guest for you today doing some really interesting work transforming leaders through the use of role play, which I think is one of the most useful leadership tools that we have out there. His name is Dr. Joe Lasley. Dr. Joe Lasley is an assistant professor at the University of Southern Maine and founder of Gamenamic Leadership. He consults and teaches leadership, organizational studies, and game design, specializing in experimental and transformational learning that uses leadership coaching to empower inner development. The goal of this work is to support teams, people, their passions, co-creating a socially just future, and having some fun while doing it. Joe, welcome to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Joe, I really appreciate you coming on. I really love role play, so I want to get into that. But before we get into that, I always want to ask, tell us about your background and how you got into this work. I mean, you're doing some really interesting work. So tell us about your journey and how it led up to this point.
Well, I've always been a huge geek and interested in gaming, and not necessarily role-playing games from the beginning, but I got into role-playing games just before I started my PhD in leadership studies. And so it was my first semester in my PhD program where it kind of clicked for me, because I did an assignment where I had to do a presentation about something, and I got to choose the topic. And so I did it about how role-playing games, like Dungeons and Dragons, but not Dungeons and Dragons, were a form of leadership and a way to learn about leadership and group dynamics. And it came so naturally to me. It just made sense. That's just how I think about leadership, and whether it's in games or not. And then one of my classmates said, "Oh, wow, I think you should really do this." And this was a person who was not a geek or a gamer, and that really said to me, wait a second, other people think this is a good idea too. This isn't just me being a silly geek playing around in my free time like this. And so that started me on the path of doing my research, several projects throughout my coursework and my dissertation on leadership development and group dynamics and role-playing games, and starting the consulting work and that I've been doing, and continuing on after graduating and kind of continuing to do research and consulting and leadership programming through role-playing games.
Yeah, I love how that came about organically. You know, it's something that you love to do, and you just made this connection. Let's dive a little bit deeper into the connection, because you said that leadership is a part of those games. You know, for people like me who aren't experts in those sort of games, help us understand, what is the connection there? How does that work, and how does that align with leadership?
Well, part of how I view what leadership is that leadership is something we experience. It's part of the human experience. You can study it in any discipline. Psychology is a pretty good one to do it in, but it's not the only one. And you can study it as people and in groups and social systems, and you could study it from creativity or teamwork, all these different things that every discipline has leadership involved in it somehow, because it's part of the human experience. And that's how, we know when we're experiencing leadership and when we're not experiencing leadership. We may not be able to communicate with each other about that to fix it right away, but that's kind of how I view leadership, as part of the human experience and human nature. And that's also something that I see in role-playing games, and my experience with role-playing games was it's play. It's universal to the human experience. And the storytelling aspect of playing in like a role-playing game is something that links our cultures across the globe. It's part of the human experience, not what the culture is, but that we have culture and that we have play and we have games. And so we tell stories together, we create narratives and roles too. We have roles in society, roles in our different groups that we're in, roles that we take on in theater and drama, and also in organizations, some dramatic, some formal, some not. But all of these things are part of human nature somehow, and we can't quite fully explain any of them, but we can start to explain different aspects by taking on different lenses and different roles and trying to do that.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you're saying there in terms of it being something that exists. It's just a part of who we are and a part of what we experience. Leadership is just one of those concepts that just really is. How do you take that understanding and apply it in a practical setting when we're talking about some of the services that you offer? Because I know you do some coaching and some game design with leaders and teams. So talk us through how that actually applies and how you actually use that in an actual business setting.
Yeah, well, I like to break things into frames. So we have different levels that we can look at because, as one big mess of an entangled phenomena, it's kind of messy and complex. That's the human experience. But we can take different slices of it at a time to try and understand it. So in a role-playing game, you have like your character, you as a player, and you as a person in a group, and then you as a person in society. And those are different layers of who you are psychologically that are happening when you're playing in a role-playing game. And so if we start with the individual level, like, because that's the other way we do it in leadership studies, is there's within the individual as a person externally, there are interactions with other individuals. We call it interpersonal.
Yeah.
And then there's group level phenomena and groups of groups, systems, intergroup things that we can look at in terms of levels of analysis for where leadership happens, because it's in all of those levels. So if we look at the individual level, this is the easiest thing to kind of recognize, and that's just role play in general. And role play is a long-standing personal development tool. It's part of how we learn as human beings, even when we're kids, whether it's through play or not. We take on different social roles to learn how to be a human in society at all stages of our development at every age. And when you get to be an adult and you're in a leadership training and you're trying to learn a new skill or a decision-making scenario, and so you take on a role in a simulation or a case study, and you role play, and you learn through role playing, even as an adult in those leadership learning situations. To take that a step further, then we do with the role playing games is you can intentionally shape your role play experience based on your personality, different aspects of your personality that you don't normally get to explore in a safer environment, because this is a game. We're just role playing. It's not even a real situation. It might feel real at different points, but let's say you're the person who always speaks up. And so you want to play the more contemplative person who, when they speak, has very powerful, wise words, but doesn't speak very often. And so then you have to play that role as your character in the game that we're playing, or vice versa, and all different aspects of personality. You can take some risks with the roles that are less familiar to you. So the role-playing aspect for personal development is a long-standing psychological development tool, and is part of one of the pillars of the role-playing game experience when we look at it as a leadership development experience, mainly because it has such deep roots in human development.
Do you have an example of when you've used this and how this has worked, so we can get a real sense of what that's like?
Oh yeah, all kinds of examples. I'll share one that's kind of a easy to relate to maybe. So I was playing a game, and this wasn't necessarily intentionally for leadership development, but this did happen, which is part of what's so fascinating to me, is that sometimes this just happens, even though it wasn't like a class.
So that way, yeah.
I want to learn this about myself. It just kind of happens, kind of thing, which that cued me on to like, ooh, what's making that happen? And can we do it on purpose? But I had a player who was at an executive level at a nonprofit, where a lot of the leadership challenges that they were dealing with as a executive leader, they had to be the system. The whole organization really depended on them in their executive role of being this system that kept the organization running and all of that. And that, of course, is a very stressful burden as an executive leader with lots of authority to maintain the system that is the organization and to do all of that. And there was a little bit of catharsis in our game, because the character that they created for our game was very buck the system, kind of character. And so there are more details to the actual fantasy story around that, but they ended up overthrowing a corrupt government and reinstalling a diplomatic society. And then they found themselves in a familiar situation where, now that they had deposed of the system, they felt responsible to replace the system. And they got to kind of really feel the full circle, like integration of all those parts of their personality and their leadership role.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that leads to a lot of questions about, psychologically what they're experiencing at work and why they would pick this role and what they're trying to say about their experience. I love the use of games, even as human beings, when we start off young, we learn through gameplay, right? And so this is just a very natural way of doing it. I think that's a really cool thing. How does this work in a team setting? Because I know you do this with teams as well and team building. How do you apply this in a team setting?
Yeah. So another really cool thing that I noticed that was happening just kind of naturally sometimes in these leisure role-playing game situations were really powerful group dynamics. Reports of people having intense bonds with their teammates, cultures that involved psychological safety because they felt free to be vulnerable and then share different ideas and create together. And so there was this aspect of group dynamics where this cohesion, psychological safety, creativity that are somehow maybe inherent, but they're somehow happening in these role-playing groups, these role-play gaming groups. And so part of my research, actually not just my dissertation, but starting then, was about the functions of group dynamics that are naturally fulfilled by the activity of role-playing a game together. And so there are functions of like psychological safety and players supporting each other and the need to be creative and even the way that improvisation kind of builds on each other's ideas. There are these natural functions of group dynamics that get enhanced and built through the process of gameplay. So in a leadership team, we might be going to a workshop and having a different discussion as a team to create our shared vision, and maybe having intentional one-on-one conversations or working with coaches to build our rapport with each other and create cohesion and psychological safety and these types of things. And in a role-playing game group, the act of playing the game facilitates that development. It's not a separate activity. It is the activity itself that helps facilitate those aspects of the group culture and the group dynamics.
So by playing the game, you're actually having those one-on-one discussions. You're practicing and learning about psychological safety. By doing, you're actually experiencing and learning. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, actually, the act of role-playing together is a vulnerable enough exercise that it deepens the sense of psychological safety. Now, it's not just going to happen automatically. There are some gaming groups where that's not the case. And there are many stories that gamers will tell you, I'm sure, of maybe even horror stories about how that was not the case. But there is some powerful psychology that gets unlocked if in the way that you play together, and being creative and not being able to script the outcome and to express yourself or maybe even take a small risk. It feels safer because it's a game at first, but then you actually kind of further develop that. It's a very iterative group process. And even the conversations that, quote unquote, well facilitated gaming groups go through about consent and which kinds of topics are okay for us to explore in our game, because maybe we're interested in a political intrigue where we have to overthrow an oppressive government kind of plot for our fantasy adventure. Or maybe that's just not somebody's wheelhouse and they're not interested in that. They'd rather, play in a different type of setting. And how do we discuss those things when they come up in the game is a conversation that a group has to have, just like any team would have to have about how we work together and how do we deal with conflict when it arises and those types of things. And so what we've done is we've launched a Lead RPG program with a client right now that's actually just wrapping up, where it's with a senior leadership team at a company that has gone through several sessions of a combination of playing a role-playing game together. We helped them build their characters and created a setting and a way of kind of a light version of a role-playing game so that learning the rules was not too much of a challenge. But all the essentials are there. They're playing a character. There are moments where they improvise scenes with each other, and the results of their actions are not always what they intend them to be. They have various successes and failures and face different challenges and advances in the plot that happen in the story that on their quest that they are trying to overcome. And in addition to the individual coaching we give them with how they built their characters and what they're learning about themselves by playing these different roles and how they're trying different pieces of personality on, the act of, every couple of weeks, spending a few hours playing together and then debriefing that play experience has itself helped their team dynamic. Just by playing, well, we say it's just by playing together. It's a little bit more than that. But by playing together in this particular way and doing debriefing and learning exercises that go along with that play experience, they have developed a different affinity and team culture amongst themselves that they're hoping to now spread to the rest of their organization.
Yeah.
But it's allowed them to feel more closely connected with one another, to have a sense of team identity, and to also have more flexibility and agency with how they take up their leadership roles with each other and be creative and innovative.
So the games don't necessarily have to be associated with the work that they're doing. It's just the experience of working on a task together, which in this case happens to be through the game format. So it's fun, right? But then they're also working a task together and they're problem solving together and they're figuring out relationships and building connections and all of those things that, that are necessary for effective teaming. That's what they're doing without actually maybe being aware of it. And then the debrief allows them to kind of understand some of the benefits of that activity. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. And it's the different layers too. So this is the team level because there are different types of learning, which is part of what I think makes it such a rich and fascinating experience to me. Is It's possible that the content itself is the learning, right? That maybe the plot of the game is about a particular leadership challenge that they're facing, like dealing with change. And so maybe the characters are themselves dealing with some organizational change that's happening. And it's direct content learning that they're doing. Then the role play is this individual development level that they get to have. And then there's this element of practice, the experiential learning of just by practicing, playing together, you're generating these dynamics in your team. And so there's the things you learn, and then there's the practice that you get to do just by playing.
Yeah. This is such, I do a little bit of role play at the end of some of my leadership development workshops, and leaders generally complain about it. They don't like it, but in the reviews, they often put that down as the best part of the whole experience. It's because it's something that actually allowed them to practice. I think that's such a great tool. But, from my experience, I know they just initially don't like it. Who is this best for? What's your ideal client and who would this work best for? Because I can't imagine that this would work well for everybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, just like with everything, not everybody is going to be prone to the same kinds of experiences, right? We all have different interests and things like that. There are a couple different angles that can be taken. I don't think this is just for one particular kind of client. And I think there are different things that different clients will find useful or pleasurable about it. And honestly, that shapes how we would build the experience. When I'm working with a group of geeks who are already like, I've played D&D for years and this is so fun and I know how to build my own character and I can muse with you about different rules and how they impact the game experience and all of that, then we can use the game system much more as a tangible object to reflect on versus someone who's never played before. And maybe this is the only time they would play because they think it's fun and they're open to it, but this isn't something they would seek out. So learning the rules of the game isn't really going to be their cup of tea. So in that experience, we try to make it much more amenable to the learner who wants to get into the experience more and not have to memorize a bunch of rules. So one angle on it is that what we do is we help people who are geeks and role players combine their passion and interest in this hobby with their own quest for personal growth and professional development.
That is so cool. I think that is such a great way of doing that.
Yeah, because to me, it's the same thing, right? Like the geeky role-playing group dynamics that are happening, the magic, so to speak, to use a term, is also leadership development. The activity is the same. Maybe for me, because I'm a leadership development expert, that's also who I am, right? I'm not just a role play gamer. I'm also a leadership development expert. I'm super reflective. I'm always questioning identity and roles and these types of things. So of course I'm going to debrief all of my games, even if it's not part of the learning exercise,
Right.
because that's just how I operate. And so whether you're a gamer and we combine the debriefing and leadership expertise, or you're a fun-loving person who's open to improvise and explore a new type of experience together, then we'll provide the gaming expertise.
That is such a cool way of doing it. I love the notion of learning without even knowing that you're learning. It's that effortless. You're enjoying yourself, and you're learning as well. It reminds me of when you're exercising, you're playing a sport that you love. You don't really think about exercise. You just think about enjoying the sport that you love, but you get the benefit of exercising as well. So this is one of those things where I think it's such a great way of working on your own individual leadership skills, but also in team dynamics as well. But not even being fully aware of that. That's what you're doing. So such a great approach. I really love this. Joe, how do people get a hold of you if they want to continue the conversation or ask you questions or follow up with you? What's a good way of reaching it?
Yeah, so I have a LinkedIn page, both for me, Joe Lasley. You can find me on LinkedIn. Also, Gamenamic Leadership has a LinkedIn page and a website, gamenamic.org. And so you can find more information there. And the email for Gamenamic is drjoe@gamenamic.org.
And, I always want to take advantage of the experts that we have on the show and ask, what's a tip that you have for people, especially leaders and organizations this day and age that we're in right now?
If I have to choose one, well, maybe I'll cheat because, we make the rules, right? That's one thing I like about gaming. The rules are all made.
Yeah.
One powerful thing, I think, is just if we as leaders in society, whether it's in organizations or government or wherever, or your personal life, is just realize that you have access to permission to play. And if you can play, whether it's with playing with ideas, playing with your roles and how you show up, or playing with being curious about new experiences or challenges that you're facing, you can learn to access your own permission to play and help others find permission to play. It really has transformative potential for everything that we're doing. And part of that, the second piece I'll say, is that realize that your identity is related to the role that you are in, whether it's in an organization or a family, but you are not your role. And so it's this interesting paradox of being within a role in an organization. And once you can start to see that you are both yourself and a role, but you are not your role, that can really transform how you think about the way you lead.
Yeah, those are so important. I think both of those, especially the first one I'm thinking about, understanding that you are, I'll start with the second one. The second one is you are not your role. I think just thinking about that and really understanding it as the separation, as you talked about in the character play, all of these different levels, but also understanding that you bring influence of all of those levels to the one role or to the one position. So whatever it is, it's the influence from the outside, but the influence of that all to the other ones as well. I think that's such a key thing for people to keep in mind. I think that's really important. The first one just escaped me. Remind me of the first one again.
Permission to play.
Permission to play. I think that's one of the things that I think we didn't even touch on is the importance of experimentation, right? Being able to play, and that's role play allows you to experiment, to try different things and see what works and what doesn't work. So I think that's one of the values of this that we didn't even touch on. There's so much value and benefit from this activity that, I think it's a great way of doing it. So I appreciate you coming on and talking about it. I think it's such a cool thing. We'll have to have you come back on and maybe walk us through a game and figure out how we can learn from it and experience it. And that would be really cool. So Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's super fun to talk about it. Thanks for being curious.
Yeah, of course. So I really want to say thank you for coming on the show. If you have been listening to the show and you've enjoyed it, please subscribe and become one of our followers. And if you have any feedback, please provide us with feedback, because feedback is a gift and we love gifts. So please provide us with some feedback. Otherwise, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next time.